They all drove past because they thought someone else would stop, but the quietest act of kindness that rainy night was about to change two lives forever. The rain had settled over the winding highway outside Asheville like a heavy gray blanket, turning every passing headlight into a shimmering ribbon across the wet pavement. Traffic slowed, windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the steady downpour, and impatient drivers kept their eyes fixed on the road ahead, instead of the shoulder where a luxury SUV rested at an awkward angle against a roadside embankment. Some glanced for only a second before accelerating again, convincing themselves that emergency crews were surely already on the way. Ethan Brooks wasn't thinking about emergencies when he noticed the vehicle. He was thinking about getting home before his 10-year-old daughter Lily finished her math homework. He had promised to help her study fractions after dinner, and promises were something he never broke. His old pickup truck rattled as he eased onto the shoulder, hazard lights blinking softly through the rain. He grabbed a flashlight, zipped up his faded work jacket, and hurried toward the disabled SUV. The driver's side window was cracked, rainwater dripping steadily along the polished black paint. Inside sat a woman in her late 30s, unconscious but breathing steadily, her forehead resting gently against the deployed airbag. Ethan knocked lightly against the glass. No response. He called out calmly, hoping not to frighten her if she woke suddenly. Still nothing. He noticed the passenger door was slightly unlatched from the impact. With careful hands, he opened it just enough to reach inside, without causing further damage. The cabin smelled faintly of expensive leather and rain-soaked fabric. He checked that she was breathing normally, then reached for his phone and dialed 911. His voice remained steady as he described the location, the weather, and the condition of the driver. While waiting for first responders, he gently draped his own work blanket over her shoulders to keep away the evening chill. The flashing lights of an ambulance appeared several minutes later, cutting through the darkness with quiet reassurance. Paramedics quickly took over, thanking Ethan for staying with her and providing clear information. One of them asked for his name. Ethan simply smiled and answered, "Just tell her someone happened to be driving by." He watched long enough to see the ambulance doors close before turning back toward his truck. His boots splashed through shallow puddles as he climbed inside, glancing at the dashboard clock. Lily would be waiting. He started the engine and disappeared into the rain before anyone thought to stop him. Back at the hospital, nurses carefully gathered the woman's belongings. A sleek leather wallet slipped from her handbag onto the examination table. An emergency room physician opened it only to locate identification for medical records. His expression changed instantly. He looked toward another nurse, then back at the driver's license, reading the name twice to make certain he hadn't imagined it. Victoria Hayes, founder and CEO of Hayes Dynamics, one of the most recognized business leaders in America. Outside, the storm slowly began to fade, but inside that hospital, a story neither of them could have imagined had already begun in complete silence. The first rays of morning sunlight spilled across the windows of Asheville Regional Medical Center, replacing the storm with a calm that felt almost unreal. Nurses moved quietly through the hallways, monitors hummed softly, and the scent of fresh coffee drifted through the intensive care wing. Victoria Hayes slowly opened her eyes, blinking against the pale light. Everything felt distant at first. The white ceiling, the steady rhythm of the heart monitor, the gentle voice of a nurse asking how she felt. She remembered the rain. She remembered gripping the steering wheel. Then everything disappeared into darkness. "You are safe now," the nurse said with a reassuring smile. "The paramedics brought you here last night." Victoria closed her eyes for a moment, trying to gather the scattered pieces of memory. "Someone helped me," she whispered. The nurse nodded. "Yes. A man stopped before emergency crews arrived. He stayed with you until we got there." Victoria turned her head. "Immediately. Where is he?" The nurse hesitated. "He left before anyone could thank him." "Did he leave his name?" "No." Victoria frowned. That answer made no sense. Everyone wanted something eventually. Recognition, gratitude, money, publicity. The man who had pulled over in the middle of a dangerous storm had accepted none of those things. A few hours later, members of Victoria's executive security team arrived, followed closely by her longtime executive assistant, Claire Morgan. Relief filled the room the moment they saw her awake. Claire stepped beside the bed with moist eyes. "You scared all of us." Victoria offered a faint smile before asking the same question again. Did anyone find the man who stopped? Claire exchanged a glance with the head of security. We have reviewed the first incident reports, but the responding officers only know that a civilian stayed until the ambulance arrived. No one collected his information. Victoria looked toward the rain-speckled window. Find him. The security director nodded confidently. We will review traffic cameras, nearby businesses, highway surveillance, and emergency dispatch recordings. We will identify him. No, Victoria answered softly. Do not find him because I am your employer. Find him because he deserves to know someone remembers what he did. Meanwhile, 20 miles away, Ethan Brooks unlocked the doors of Brooks Auto Repair just before 7:30 in the morning. The familiar scent of motor oil, fresh coffee, and worn pine shelves welcomed him like an old friend. He rolled up the garage door as sunlight reflected across rows of well-used tools. His pickup truck still carried traces of mud from the previous night, but he hardly noticed. His thoughts were already on the next customer waiting for an oil change before work. A small bicycle rolled into the garage driveway. Lily jumped off with a bright smile, wearing her backpack almost as large as she was. Did we finish all the fractions right? Ethan asked. She laughed proudly. I got every question right because you explained them better than my teacher. Ethan smiled, gently brushing a loose strand of blonde hair away from her face. That sounds like the best news I will hear all day. Neither of them realized that only a few miles away, one of the most influential women in America had quietly begun searching for the man who believed keeping a promise to his daughter was more important than accepting the gratitude of a billionaire. 3 days passed, and every lead seemed to disappear into the ordinary rhythm of American life. Security specialists reviewed highway cameras, interviewed first responders, and examined every report from the storm. But the man who had stopped that night remained invisible. Victoria Hayes sat quietly in her office on the top floor of Hayes Dynamics, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Yet her attention never settled on the quarterly reports spread across her desk. Her board expected discussions about acquisitions and market forecasts, but her thoughts kept returning to a stranger wearing a weathered work jacket who had chosen compassion over convenience. Claire Morgan entered with a tablet in her hands and a careful expression. We finally found something, she said. Victoria looked up immediately. One traffic camera captured a partial image of an older pickup truck leaving the scene before emergency vehicles cleared the highway. Can you identify the owner? Victoria asked. Claire nodded slowly. Not directly, but the truck stopped later that morning at a local parts supplier. The payment records match a repair shop outside Asheville. Less than 2 hours later, a black sport utility vehicle rolled quietly through a small town where brick storefronts, family diners, and tree-lined sidewalks carried a slower rhythm than the corporate world Victoria knew. She chose not to bring cameras, reporters, or additional security. She wanted to thank one man, not create a public event. Brooks Auto Repair stood at the edge of town beneath a faded wooden sign that had weathered decades of mountain seasons. The garage door stood open, allowing warm afternoon sunlight to spill across the concrete floor. Country music played softly from an old radio while the scent of fresh coffee mixed with motor oil and clean sawdust. Victoria paused before stepping inside. The place felt unexpectedly peaceful. She watched a man kneeling beside an elderly woman's aging sedan. Ethan Brooks carefully tightened a loose battery connection before closing the hood with gentle hands. Try it now, he said with an encouraging smile. The elderly woman turned the key, and the engine started smoothly. Relief spread across her face. How much do I owe you? She asked. Ethan shook his head. Nothing today. Just promise me you will let your grandson replace those worn tires before winter. The woman laughed softly. You always find a way to send me home without taking my money. Ethan smiled. Safe roads are worth more than a repair bill. Victoria remained standing near the entrance, unnoticed for another moment. She had negotiated billion-dollar contracts with complete confidence, yet somehow introducing herself to this quiet mechanic felt strangely intimidating. Before she could speak, a cheerful voice echoed across the garage. Dad, I finished my science project. Lily hurried inside, carrying a carefully painted model of the solar system, her bright smile lighting the room. Ethan wiped his hands with a clean towel before kneeling beside her. That looks incredible, he said. I knew you could do it. Lily wrapped her arms around him for a quick hug before noticing the unfamiliar visitor. Ethan turned, following his daughter's curious eyes. For the first time since the storm, he found himself looking directly at the woman whose life had quietly crossed his own. Neither of them spoke immediately. The garage became strangely still, filled only with the soft ticking of a cooling engine and the distant song of wind moving through the maple trees outside. Victoria was the first to break the silence. "I have been looking for you for 3 days," she said, her voice gentle enough that it carried no trace of the authority people usually associated with her name. Ethan looked at her for a moment before offering a modest smile. "Looks like you found me." Lily glanced curiously between them, sensing that this stranger already knew something important about her father. Victoria stepped forward slowly, careful not to interrupt the peaceful rhythm of the little garage. "I never had the chance to thank you," she said. "You stayed with me that night when everyone else kept driving." Ethan shrugged as though she were talking about something ordinary. Anyone would have done the same. Victoria smiled faintly. "I wish that were true." She reached into her handbag and carefully removed an envelope. "Please accept this. It will never equal what you did, but I would feel better knowing I expressed my gratitude." Ethan did not even glance at the envelope. Instead, he folded the clean shop towel over his shoulder and shook his head. "I cannot take it." Victoria looked surprised. "You have not even seen what is inside." "I do not need to." His answer was calm, almost effortless. Helping someone is not a business transaction. The words settled quietly inside the garage. Outside, a light breeze carried the scent of pine through the open doors while a wind chime hanging from the porch gently rang in the afternoon air. Lily walked toward the office to finish her homework, giving the two adults a little privacy without anyone asking her to. Victoria lowered the envelope. During years of leading one of the largest technology companies in the country, she had solved complicated negotiations worth billions of dollars. Yet this simple mechanic had ended the conversation with one sentence she could not argue against. "Then let me buy lunch," she offered with a hopeful smile. Ethan laughed softly. "That sounds expensive for someone who only dialed 911 and waited for the ambulance." She laughed for the first time in days. "You make it sound much smaller than it was." Ethan leaned against the workbench, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes people think changing a life requires something extraordinary. Most of the time it just requires stopping when everyone else keeps going." Victoria studied him quietly. There was no pride in his voice, no expectation of admiration. He spoke as though kindness were simply another responsibility, no different from tightening a loose bolt or changing worn brake pads. She realized that was exactly what had unsettled her ever since the accident. Nearly everyone she met recognized her title before they recognized her as a person. Ethan had done the opposite. He had seen only someone who needed help. As she prepared to leave, her eyes drifted toward an old framed photograph resting on a shelf inside the office. Ethan stood beside a smiling woman with one arm around a much younger Lily. The corners of the picture had faded with time, but the happiness in their faces remained clear. Victoria looked back at Ethan without asking any questions. Somehow she understood that every quiet person carried a story, and she suddenly wanted to know his far more than she wanted him to know hers. The following Saturday arrived with bright autumn sunshine and cool mountain air that carried the scent of fallen leaves through the streets of the small town. Ethan had nearly forgotten about his unexpected visitor until a silver sedan rolled quietly into the parking lot of Brooks Auto Repair just after 10 o'clock. Victoria stepped out wearing simple blue jeans, a light sweater, and comfortable walking shoes. Without the tailored business suits or the crowd of assistants that usually surrounded her, she looked less like the leader of a global company and more like someone hoping for an ordinary day. Ethan glanced up from replacing a set of brake pads and smiled politely. "Everything all right with your car?" Victoria smiled back. "Actually, nothing is wrong with it." Ethan laughed softly. "That is usually good news around here." She looked around the garage, admiring the shelves lined with carefully organized tools and family photographs that had gathered memories instead of dust. "I was wondering if you might let me buy you and Lily lunch today instead." Ethan hesitated for a moment before answering. "Only if you let me choose the place." 20 minutes later, the three of them were sitting together inside a small family diner overlooking the Blue Ridge Mountains. The booths were worn, the coffee was fresh, and nearly every customer greeted Ethan by name as they walked inside. Lily noticed immediately. "Dad knows everybody." Ethan smiled. "That just means I have lived here a long time." Victoria watched the easy conversations unfold. The waitress never asked if Ethan could afford the meal. An elderly couple stopped to thank him for repairing their truck before winter. A teenage cashier waved enthusiastically at Lily, who happily waved back. It was a community built on familiar faces instead of impressive titles. When the food arrived, Lily excitedly described her dream of becoming an engineer who designed safer cars because, as she proudly explained, if people build better cars, maybe fewer families will have scary days. Victoria listened carefully, touched by the quiet wisdom in the child's words. "That is a wonderful dream," she said. Lily grinned. "Dad says fixing things is good, but making them better is even better." Victoria looked across the table at Ethan. "She sounds exactly like you." Ethan shook his head with a gentle smile. "She sounds much smarter than I ever was." After lunch, they walked through the town square, where a weekend farmer's market filled the sidewalks with homemade bread, fresh apples, colorful flowers, and local musicians playing gentle acoustic songs beneath the trees. Victoria realized something unexpected had happened during the past few hours. For the first time in many years, no one had asked her about stock prices, business strategies, or corporate decisions. They simply treated her like another neighbor enjoying a peaceful afternoon. As the sun drifted lower across the mountains, she quietly wondered whether success had slowly taken her farther away from simple moments like these than she had ever intended. And beside her, Ethan walked without trying to impress anyone, unaware that his ordinary life was quietly becoming the place where Victoria felt most at home. Monday morning brought Victoria back to the polished glass headquarters of Hayes Dynamics. But the quiet peace she had found over the weekend disappeared the moment the elevator doors opened. Executives waited outside the boardroom with tablets in their hands. Conversations paused as she approached. Quarterly forecasts, investor presentations, and acquisition proposals filled the agenda. Yet she found herself thinking about the small garage where every handshake had been sincere and every smile had carried no hidden expectation. The board meeting began promptly at 9 o'clock. Financial charts illuminated the large screen while directors discussed expansion into new markets. Victoria listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and made several important decisions. But even Claire Morgan noticed that something in her expression had changed. During a short break, Claire quietly closed the conference room door behind them. "You have been somewhere else all morning," she observed with a gentle smile. Victoria looked out across the city skyline before answering. "I spent years believing success meant making every minute productive. Then I met someone who measures a successful day by whether he kept a promise to his daughter." Claire nodded thoughtfully. "That kind of perspective is rare." Later that afternoon, an unexpected visitor arrived. Daniel Mercer, a longtime board member and one of the company's largest investors, greeted Victoria warmly before lowering his voice. "There have been questions," he said carefully. "Some people noticed your vehicle was seen near a repair shop outside Asheville more than once." Victoria remained calm. "I visited someone who helped me." Daniel folded his hands. "There is nothing wrong with gratitude. But public attention can create stories that neither you nor the company may want." Victoria appreciated his concern, yet the conversation left an uncomfortable weight in her heart. Meanwhile, Ethan's day unfolded much as every Monday had for years. He repaired an aging pickup for a local carpenter, replaced brake pads on a schoolteacher's sedan, and patiently explained maintenance tips to a young couple buying their first family vehicle. The steady rhythm of honest work suited him. Just before closing time, Lily arrived carrying a permission slip for a school science fair. "They want parents to build something with us," she said excitedly. Ethan smiled. "What are we making?" "A model bridge," Lily answered. "Strong enough to hold 20 pounds. Ethan laughed softly. "Then we had better build it together." As father and daughter spread pencils and graph paper across the office desk, Ethan noticed a small envelope tucked beneath the shop's front door. There was no company logo and no return address. Inside rested a handwritten note. "Thank you for reminding me that the strongest foundations are built with kindness, not status. I hope this is not the last conversation we share." At the bottom was a single signature. "Victoria." Ethan read the note twice before carefully placing it inside the drawer where he kept the most meaningful things in his life. Outside, the evening sun settled behind the Blue Ridge Mountains, painting the sky with warm shades of gold. while neither of them realized that the greatest challenge they would soon face would not come from distance, but from the worlds they each called home. Several days passed without another visit, and the silence felt unfamiliar to both of them. Ethan never reached for his phone because he did not have Victoria's number, and even if he had, he was not the kind of man who believed every connection should be pursued. Life at the garage continued as always. Customers arrived with noisy engines and everyday worries. Lily came after school carrying another science assignment and stories about her classmates. The steady rhythm of ordinary life had always been enough for Ethan, yet every now and then he caught himself glancing toward the entrance whenever a car slowed outside. Across the state, Victoria found herself surrounded by polished conference rooms and carefully prepared presentations, but none of them held her attention the way they once had. During a meeting with senior executives, a discussion about expanding into several new markets drifted into the background as she absent-mindedly traced circles on the edge of her notebook. Claire Morgan quietly noticed. "You are thinking about Asheville again," she said after the meeting ended. Victoria smiled with quiet honesty. "I think I am thinking about a man who has no idea how much he has changed my perspective." Claire folded her arms with a knowing expression. "Then perhaps the question is not whether you should see him again. Perhaps the question is whether you are willing to let the rest of your world know." Before Victoria could answer, her communications director entered carrying a tablet. "There is something you should see." A local social media page had posted a simple photograph of Victoria walking through the small farmers market beside Ethan and Lily. The caption was harmless, but the comments beneath it had already begun to grow. Some people praised her for spending time with ordinary Americans. Others questioned why the chief executive of a billion-dollar company appeared so comfortable in a small repair shop. The story spread faster than anyone expected. By the following morning, several business websites had reposted the photograph, adding speculation where no facts existed. Ethan remained unaware until one of his longtime customers walked into the garage holding a newspaper. "Looks like you made the news," the older man joked with a warm smile. Ethan accepted the paper with visible surprise. There, on the lower half of the business section, was the same photograph. He sighed quietly instead of smiling. That evening, after Lily had gone upstairs to finish reading before bed, Ethan sat alone on the front porch with the newspaper folded beside him. The cool mountain breeze carried the scent of pine through the quiet neighborhood as porch lights slowly flickered on one by one. He thought about Victoria, not as the leader of a global company, but as the woman who had laughed over lunch and admired Lily's dreams. He also understood something that neither of them had spoken aloud. His world valued privacy, simple routines, and familiar faces. Hers lived beneath constant attention. As the last light faded behind the Blue Ridge Mountains, Ethan gently folded the newspaper and whispered to himself, "The last thing she needs is for my ordinary life to become another headline." At that same moment, Victoria stood alone in her office, looking out across the city lights, unaware that the man she respected most was quietly preparing to step back because he believed protecting her mattered more than holding on to the happiness he had only just begun to discover. The following week brought the annual Leadership Summit for Hayes Dynamics, an event attended by executives, investors, employees, and community partners from across the country. The auditorium filled long before the program began, and conversations echoed beneath the high ceiling as cameras prepared to broadcast the keynote address. Victoria stood quietly backstage, holding a small note card that remained almost blank. Claire Morgan approached with a reassuring smile. "Everyone is expecting an announcement about the company's future." Victoria nodded. "They will hear one, just not the one they expect." Several hours earlier, Ethan had received an invitation to attend the event as a guest of the company's community outreach program. At first he planned to decline. Public attention had never appealed to him, and he believed the growing headlines had already caused enough distraction. Lily, however, gently placed her hand on his arm. "Dad, sometimes showing up is another way of being kind." Her words lingered in his mind, and before he realized it, they were sitting together in the last few rows of the auditorium, hoping to remain unnoticed among hundreds of guests. The lights gradually dimmed as Victoria walked onto the stage. Warm applause filled the room before settling into silence. She thanked her colleagues for their dedication and spoke briefly about innovation, responsibility, and serving communities. Then she paused. The audience sensed the change immediately. She placed her prepared remarks aside and looked across the crowd with quiet sincerity. A few weeks ago, she began, I experienced something that reminded me leadership is not measured by titles or market value. It is measured by character when nobody is watching. The room became still. On a rainy evening, a complete stranger stopped to help me. He did not know my name. He did not ask what I could offer him. He simply saw another human being who needed assistance. After he knew I was safe, he left without waiting for recognition. Several people exchanged curious glances. Victoria continued. Since that day, I have learned that integrity does not always stand behind a podium. Sometimes it works quietly in a neighborhood repair shop. Sometimes it spends evenings helping a daughter with homework instead of chasing attention. Sometimes the strongest example of success is choosing kindness when there is nothing to gain. Ethan lowered his eyes, realizing the story could only be about him. Lily looked at him with a proud smile, but said nothing. Victoria looked toward the back of the auditorium until her eyes found them. She did not ask him to stand. She did not reveal private details. She simply smiled with gratitude. Whoever that man is, she said softly, I hope he knows he reminded me that no accomplishment will ever matter more than becoming the kind of person someone can trust on the hardest day of their life. The audience rose in quiet applause, not because they had witnessed a dramatic revelation, but because they recognized an uncommon truth. Ethan remained seated beside Lily, grateful that Victoria had honored his privacy while still honoring his example. In that moment, both of them understood that respect had become the strongest bridge between their two very different worlds. Autumn slowly gave way to the first hints of winter, and life settled into a quieter rhythm than either Ethan or Victoria had expected. The headlines faded, new business stories replaced old speculation, and the attention that had briefly surrounded them drifted somewhere else. Brooks Auto Repair remained as welcoming as ever, its front windows glowing warmly against the crisp mountain air each morning. Hayes Dynamics continued to expand under Victoria's thoughtful leadership, but those closest to her noticed a subtle difference. She smiled more often. She listened more carefully. She no longer rushed through every conversation as though the next meeting mattered more than the person standing in front of her. One Saturday afternoon, Victoria drove back to the little town without a schedule, an assistant, or a security detail. She found Ethan and Lily in the front yard of their modest home, kneeling beside a flower bed that had been cleared for the winter. Lily looked up first and waved enthusiastically. You came at the perfect time, she called. We are planting a maple tree. Victoria laughed softly. I have never been very good at gardening. Ethan stood, brushing the soil from his hands with the familiar quiet smile she had come to recognize. Trees are patient. They forgive beginners. Without another word, he handed her a pair of gardening gloves. The three of them spent the afternoon digging, measuring, and carefully settling the young tree into the ground. No photographers waited beyond the fence. No reporters interrupted the silence. Only the sound of birds settling into nearby branches and the gentle rustle of leaves accompanied their work. When the final shovel of soil had been pressed firmly around the roots, Lily stepped back and admired their work with obvious satisfaction. It will be really tall someday, she said. Ethan nodded. Only because it has strong roots. Victoria looked from the small tree to Ethan, understanding that he was speaking about far more than gardening. She had spent years building companies, but he had spent years building a home where kindness, honesty, and quiet promises shaped every ordinary day. As the afternoon sun dipped behind the Blue Ridge Mountains, Ethan walked onto the porch carrying 3 mugs of hot apple cider. They sat together watching the golden light stretch across the valley. After several peaceful minutes, Victoria finally broke the comfortable silence. I used to believe the biggest moments in life arrived with applause, she admitted. Now I think they arrive like this. Ethan looked across the yard where Lily laughed as she carefully watered the newly planted tree. The best things usually do, he replied. Their hands rested side by side on the wooden porch railing. After a quiet pause, Ethan gently reached over and took Victoria's hand. There was no dramatic declaration, no audience, and no promise that everything ahead would be easy. There was only trust, earned one ordinary day at a time. Victoria smiled, not because a remarkable story had changed her life overnight, but because a simple act of kindness had slowly become something deeper than either of them had imagined. The little maple tree stood between the porch and the front gate, its roots hidden beneath the earth, quietly beginning a future no one could yet see. Like the strongest relationships, it did not grow because of attention. It grew because someone chose to care before expecting anything in return, proving that the most enduring love often begins in complete silence and flourishes through everyday acts of grace. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more stories of courage, kindness, and second chances, because the people the world overlooks often leave the greatest impact.